All right, for this technique, we're gonna talk about the wet on wet watercolor, just like the name implies. It's which you already have a wet piece of paper and you apply that wet paint that we need to or have when we're actually working with watercolors. Okay. So a couple different ways that you can do this. You can start simply by taking just some fresh water and getting your paper wet to start with, and then taking some of that wet paint that you have and then painting it on there. Okay? You can see like that one little stroke. I'm gonna do the same one over here with wet on dry and wet on wet. Huge, huge, huge difference. And so this is definitely an experimental one. One thing kind of comparing the two, wet on dry, you'll find you have a lot more control about where you're actually putting these, your marks and color, where wet on wet, each kind of one of those different brush strokes will eventually spread and move around and maybe mix with other colors, and you'll have a little bit less control there. Okay, so some people like the look of this. It definitely has its place. You do lose some control, so a lot of people don't like working wet on wet with watercolors, but it's definitely something that we should practice. Like I said earlier in the wet on dry video, getting your paper wet is one idea. Also, just painting, wet on dry here, and then going back in with another color. Let's say I want to do that brown again. And then working over top of this already painted area, right? That's considered wet on wet, which is the technique we're doing now, because that paint is wet as we do it here. Okay? And so working kind of repeatedly over and over in one section eventually turns from wet on dry to wet on wet. Okay? With these different samples, you're thinking of all of the different, stippling. Maybe we're dropping in, maybe trying to get one solid color and figure out what that looks like, kind of dropped in, maybe the difference between wet on dry, wet on wet, the different kind of techniques, things that you can do with kind of that wet on wet. What you also can do is just take wet kind of water and paint it over top of kind of that already wet on dry paper, see it kind of fade out. So there's a lot of different things that you can do with kind of this wet on wet, knowing that you probably are going to have a little bit less control about where this thing and where the paint actually ends up. The last thing with wet on wet is I want you to see what this looks like after it dries. Right? With wet on dry, it can dry pretty quickly and easily, and you can kind of see what you're working with. With wet on wet, it might take a little bit longer. And so I encourage you to, after you practice, get a bunch of samples. After it's dry, then look to identify and see your samples and figure out which ones you're gonna put and paint on your skill set card.